Hi, fifth graders. We are talking about your reading selection for this week called The Case of the Missing Bees. So, The Case of the Missing Bees it's a persuasive article. It's trying to get you to think one way about the case of the missing bees. Hopefully, you could kind of pick up on which one they were leaning towards. But the CCD is the colony collapse disorder. And as you read, that is when bees fly away from the colony and they never return. As we saw, this started about a little while ago anyway, past few years, and they've noticed that there's about 50% less than what it was 50 years ago. And why does this matter? Why are we so concerned about the bees being gone? Well, part of this is because they told us that 1/3 of the crops need the bees to pollinate them so that they can produce the food we eat. And that's a very important part. And they also make our honey. I'm going to move this over here so you can see it. Okay. So they make honey and they help pollinate the food or the plants that later become our food. Well, when we were looking at what would cause this to happen, what causes this to happen, there's a couple different reasons. Here's 5 different ones that they came up with, but there's one they focused in on more so. But let's talk about each one of these a little bit. So we have overcrowded hives. In overcrowded hives, there's just too many bees in one hive and some of them start to die off. And that was saying one cause of this CCD. The second one is the lack of pollen. Maybe not as many crops, so they can't find their pollen, and then they don't have as many to survive because they need that pollen. That's their winter food. And then we get to parasites. Parasites, they talked about a little bit more in depth. They talked about how the parasites can cause problems with the pesticides too. When we look at the pesticides, that's where we really get a big amount of information, especially starting on 426. And they tell us that there are about 20 to 40% of the bees that died out. They think that spraying that pesticide on the crops might cause the problem because that chemical or that pesticide can be absorbed into the pollen and then they take that back with them. When they have that pesticide, apparently sometimes they can become confused and they can't find their way back and they get lost and then they end up dying out. So that was another idea that came across in your reading. And they talked more in depth about that. Then they talked about the fungus and the virus together. The fungus and the virus together became a deadly combination. They said that when they studied a beehive that was thriving, that had a lot of bees in there, honey was being made, everything was good, and then they studied one that had died out, that there was basically an empty hive. And every time they studied these empty hives, they found the combination of the virus and the fungus together. And so that was giving them their evidence or their support as to why they think a fungus and a virus are the cause. They also talked about how in Florida and California, they found 50 different human-made chemicals in the hives, and that was also a different piece, but they didn't say for sure whether the chemicals, or if it was the pesticides, or if it was the virus and the fungus that causes this. Very much concerned about keeping them alive and finding out what's going on. and especially for saving the crops and for, like we said, the honey too. So they gave us a sentence here. Until the blank is known, the problem cannot be solved. What needs to be known? What did they say? Well, it starts with a C and then has an A, and you probably guessed it already. Until the cause is known, the problem cannot be solved. They need to find the cause of this, and then they can figure out what to do next. Okay? Um, Hopefully, you could see a little bit about how they um, they are trying to, that this is a bad thing, that they're not, that they are concerned about the lack of bees. If you look on 429, you can see a chart about the different crops and how the portion that are honeybees that pollinate them and they depend on is listed there. And it also gives us that bigger feeling of how our agriculture cannot survive without these little bees and how good the bees are. So you have two pieces, excuse me, that they're talking about how it hurts our environment, our crops, our livelihood without the bees, and how the bees are so beneficial to us, making that honey that we eat, um, and helping those crops. And every country has that, where they need those crops. They talk about other countries too dealing with the bee problems. They bring in France under the unusual suspects when they're talking about these problems and pesticides and things like that. So, yeah, I hope you learned a lot from this, and I hope you can see how natural events and human activities affect the environment. And good luck on your test when you take it. Don't forget to go over your vocabulary words that you have there in your book to make sure you know them. And remember, you can always use your book during those tests. All right. Have a good weekend, and I'll talk to you later.